I sat in that mahogany-paneled law office, watching my family fidget in those expensive leather chairs as the attorney cracked open my grandfather's will. Thomas Hartwell had built a construction empire worth $800 million, dollars, and everyone knew today would change our lives forever. My father Richard kept adjusting his tie with that smirk he wore when he felt superior. My brother Derek scrolled through his phone, probably already planning his spending spree. Various cousins whispered about vacation homes and sports cars. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading. Everyone received millions. Dad got 200 million, Derek 50 million, cousins 10 million each. Then my name $40 cash. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I watched my father's smirk transform into something resembling victory, while Derek actually started laughing out loud. The sound echoed off those polished oak walls, bouncing around the 15th floor corner office like some cruel joke playing on repeat. $40 for 40 years of disappointment. My cousin Jennifer muttered, not even trying to hide her amusement. She was already calculating how many designer handbags 10 million could buy her manicured fingers dancing across her phone's calculator app. The attorney, a stern-faced man named Harold Patterson, who had known our family for decades, handed me a simple white envelope. Inside were two crisp $20 bills that felt strange against my calloused fingers. While everyone else received thick legal documents outlining their newfound wealth, I got pocket change that wouldn't even cover dinner at the restaurant they were probably planning to celebrate at. My father stood up, straightening his $3,000 suit jacket with theatrical flair. "Well, Billy, I guess this settles any questions about your place in this family." His voice carried that familiar tone of condescension I'd heard since childhood. "Maybe now you'll understand why I tried so hard to get you interested in the business side instead of all that manual labor nonsense." The irony burned deep in my throat. For the past 10 years since I turned 18, I'd been working construction jobs across the city. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand what my grandfather's empire was actually built on. While my family lived in their glass towers, I learned to pour concrete frame houses and read blueprints by the light of work lamps. Derek wiped tears of laughter from his eyes. "Seriously, Billy, what are you going to do with $40? Buy a nice lunch." The cruelty in his voice surprised me. We used to be close as kids, building model airplanes and racing bikes around our grandfather's estate. Success had turned him into someone I barely recognized. I studied those $20 bills more carefully while my family planned their new lives around me. Something felt different about them beyond their crisp newness. Under the office's bright fluorescent lighting, I noticed tiny marks along the edges. Faint pencil scratches that looked almost like coordinates, or maybe some kind of code. My grandfather had always been a puzzle man. Sunday afternoons at his house meant riddles, brain teasers, and elaborate treasure hunts through his massive library. He taught me that the most valuable things in life were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to look closer. While my relatives discussed which luxury cars they'd buy first, I traced those barely visible markings with my fingertip. They definitely weren't random. Thomas Hartwell never did anything without purpose, especially when it came to money. These bills had been specifically chosen, specifically marked, and specifically given to me for a reason I couldn't yet understand. The attorney finished distributing documents and answering questions about tax implications and transfer procedures. My family members shook hands, hugged each other, and made plans to meet at Morton's Steakhouse to celebrate their good fortune. Nobody bothered to invite me, which honestly came as a relief. As they filed out of that office chattering excitedly about investment opportunities and vacation destinations, I remained seated in my worn flannel shirt and work boots. The contrast between their designer clothing and my everyday attire had never felt more pronounced. They looked like they belonged in this world of legal documents and inherited wealth. I looked like exactly what I was, a construction worker who'd rather spend his days building something real than pushing papers around a conference table. My father paused at the door, turning back with that expression he wore whenever he wanted to deliver a particularly cutting remark. Don't spend it all in one place, son. The word son dripped with disappointment, as if my very existence had somehow tarnished the family name. After they left, I sat alone in that quiet office studying those marked bills under every available light source. The scratches formed a definite pattern, though I couldn't decode their meaning yet. Whatever my grandfather intended, these $40 represented far more than their face value. They were a message, a clue, maybe even a test. Harold Patterson approached my chair, his expression softer now that we were alone. Billy, I want you to know that your grandfather spoke about you often in his final months. More than he spoke about anyone else in the family, actually. Those words hit harder than I expected. My grandfather and I had maintained a close relationship despite my family's disapproval, meeting regularly at construction sites, where he'd point out architectural details and share stories about building his empire from nothing. He understood my passion for creating things with my hands rather than inheriting them through birthright. I folded those marked $20 bills carefully and slipped them into my wallet. Whatever message they contained, whatever test or challenge my grandfather had designed, I would figure it out. The man who taught me to see potential in empty lots and abandoned buildings wouldn't have left me with just $40 unless those dollars held the key to something much bigger. The next morning, I drove my beat-up pickup truck to First National Bank, the massive granite building where my grandfather had conducted business for over 50 years. The contrast between my dusty Ford and the luxury cars in the parking lot couldn't have been starker, but I'd stopped caring about appearances a long time ago. Inside, the lobby buzzed with quiet efficiency. Marble floors reflected the soft lighting, while well-dressed customers conducted their financial business in hushed tones. I approached the main counter feeling slightly out of place in my work clothes and asked to speak with someone about examining some bills I'd inherited. The teller, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, looked at me skeptically. Sir, if you're questioning the authenticity of your currency, I can certainly have our manager take a look, but it's unusual for counterfeit bills to make it into estate distributions. I explained that I wasn't worried about counterfeiting, but rather some markings that might be significant. She disappeared into a back office, returning moments later with Patricia Walsh, the bank manager. Patricia was a woman in her early 50s, with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that had probably seen every financial scheme imaginable. Mr. Hartwell, she said, recognizing my last name immediately. I'm so sorry for your family's loss. Your grandfather was one of our most respected clients. How can I help you today? I laid the two $20 bills on her desk, explaining about the faint markings I'd discovered. Patricia picked up a magnifying glass from her desk drawer and examined the bills under her desk lamp. What happened next changed everything. Her face went completely white. She set down the magnifying glass and stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Excuse me for just a moment," she said, her voice suddenly tight with tension. She picked up her phone and dialed an extension. "Security, this is Patricia Walsh. I need you to escort Mr. Billy Hartwell to conference room B immediately. Yes, the secure one." My heart started racing. What had I stumbled into? Patricia refused to answer my questions as a security guard appeared and led me through a series of doors I'd never noticed during my previous visits to this bank. We walked down a hallway lined with serious-looking portraits of the bank's founding families, then through another door that required a key card to open. The conference room was unlike anything I'd seen in a regular bank. No windows, thick carpeting that absorbed sound, and walls that looked like they could withstand an explosion. Patricia entered behind us, carrying a small metal box and wearing latex gloves. "Billy," she said, sitting across from me at the polished table, "these serial numbers." She held up my $20 bills. "I've been waiting 23 years for someone to bring me these exact bills." The room felt like it was spinning. 23 years. That would have been around the time I was born. Patricia opened the metal box, revealing a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. and my grandfather's distinctive signature stamped into it. Your grandfather opened a special account here in 1999. She continued, her voice now filled with something approaching awe. He deposited these specific bills and left very detailed instructions. If anyone ever brought them to this bank, I was to immediately escort them to this room and provide them with the contents of safety deposit box number 1947. 1947. The year my grandfather started Hartwell Construction with nothing but a borrowed pickup truck and an unshakable belief in the power of hard work. My hands trembled as Patricia produced an ornate brass key from the envelope. "There's more," she said, studying my face carefully. "Your grandfather specified that only someone who had worked construction for at least 5 years and could identify specific architectural elements in a series of photographs would be allowed access to the box. He was very particular about ensuring his chosen heir truly understood the business from the ground up." The photographs she showed me depicted various buildings around our city. I recognized them immediately as some of my grandfather's earliest projects: a small office building downtown, a residential complex on the east side, and the elementary school where I'd attended kindergarten. Patricia asked me to identify specific construction techniques, materials used, and structural innovations my grandfather had pioneered. Every question came easily. Years of working alongside experienced carpenters, electricians, and masons had taught me to read buildings like books. I could see the craftsmanship in those black and white photographs, the attention to detail that had made Hartwell Construction legendary in our industry. Patricia nodded with satisfaction after each correct answer. "Your grandfather said you'd know. He said you were the only family member who'd bothered to learn what construction actually meant." She stood up, smoothing her conservative business suit. "Mr. Hartwell, if you'll follow me to our vault level, we'll retrieve your inheritance." The elevator descended 2 floors below street level, opening into a world I never knew existed beneath the familiar bank lobby. Steel-reinforced walls, biometric scanners, and security cameras monitored every square inch of space. Our footsteps echoed in the absolute silence as Patricia led me past rows of safety deposit boxes toward a special section marked Private Vault Access. Box 1947 was larger than I expected, more like a small filing cabinet than a typical safety deposit box. Patricia inserted her master key while I used the brass key from the envelope. The mechanism clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through my entire body. Inside, I found documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my inheritance, my family, and my future. The first item was a handwritten letter in my grandfather's familiar script, "Billy, if you're reading this, then you've proven yourself worthy of the truth." My hands shook as I unfolded my grandfather's letter, his familiar handwriting bringing back memories of construction site meetings where he'd sketch building modifications on napkins and coffee-stained paper. The vault's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the pages, but every word came through with crystal clarity. "Billy, by now you've discovered that the will reading was nothing more than an elaborate performance. Your father received exactly what he deserved: temporary access to wealth he never earned and doesn't understand how to preserve. Your brother and cousins inherited money that will disappear within 5 years because they've never learned the value of building something lasting." I had to stop reading and steady my breathing. The implications were staggering. Everything I'd witnessed in that law office, all the humiliation and family mockery, had been carefully orchestrated. "The real will is contained in this safety deposit box," the letter continued. "You inherit the entire Hartwell Construction empire, $800 million in assets, $237 million in liquid capital, and 14 major ongoing projects across 6 states. However, this inheritance comes with conditions that must be met within exactly 30 days of the public will reading." 30 days. I glanced at my watch, realizing I'd already lost 1 day sitting in shock and confusion. 29 days to prove myself worthy of an empire my grandfather had spent 60 years building. Your challenges are threefold. First, you must complete the Veteran Village housing project that I began 6 months ago. It's currently stalled due to funding issues your father created, but the real problem is leadership. Second, you must reunite our original construction crew, the men who helped me build this company, when we had nothing but determination and work ethic. Third, you must prove your business acumen by securing one major contract that demonstrates your understanding of both construction and commerce. I found myself laughing despite the overwhelming pressure. My grandfather had always believed in learning through doing, never through lectures or theoretical study. These challenges would force me to demonstrate every skill he'd tried to teach me over the years. If you fail any portion of this test, the inheritance reverts permanently to the public will. Your family keeps their millions, and the Hartwell name disappears from the construction industry forever. But Billy, if you succeed, something remarkable happens. The public will become null and void. Every penny your family received returns to the company accounts, and you become sole owner of everything I built. The vault seemed to tilt around me. My family's inheritance was temporary contingent on my failure. If I proved myself, they'd lose everything while I gained control of a construction empire. The poetic justice felt almost too perfect to believe. Additional documents in the box revealed the scope of my grandfather's planning. Detailed financial records showed exactly how he'd arranged the temporary transfers to my family members. Legal paperwork demonstrated that every dollar they'd received was technically a loan against the estate callable within 30 days if certain conditions were met. Most shocking was a thick folder labeled Billy's Performance Reviews. My grandfather had been documenting my construction work for years, photographing projects I'd completed, collecting supervisor evaluations, and tracking my skill development. Comments from foremen praised my work ethic, problem-solving abilities, and natural leadership qualities. He'd been preparing this test long before his death, gathering evidence of my capabilities, while my family dismissed me as a disappointment. The Veteran Village project files painted a clear picture of my first challenge. 24 housing units designed specifically for elderly veterans, complete with accessibility features and community spaces. Construction had begun 8 months ago, but stalled when my father diverted project funds to other investments. The original crew had been dismissed, permits had expired, and weather damage had set the timeline back by several weeks. But buried in those files was something that made my heart race: contact information for Jake Morrison, my grandfather's longtime foreman, and the man who taught me more about construction than any college course ever could. Jake had been laid off along with the rest of the crew, but according to my grandfather's notes, he'd been quietly maintaining the job site and keeping equipment secure. The second folder contained business cards and phone numbers for every member of our original construction team, Carlos Ramirez, the electrician, who could wire a building in half the time of anyone else in the city, Frank DeMarco, a plumber whose pipe-fitting skills bordered on artistic, Tony Castellano, a carpenter who'd learned his trade from his Italian grandfather and could make wood do things that seemed impossible. These men had helped build my grandfather's reputation, one project at a time. They'd been loyal to the Hartwell name for decades, and according to the notes, they'd all refused other permanent positions after being dismissed. They were waiting for the company to call them back. The third challenge seemed the most daunting until I read the details. My grandfather had been quietly negotiating a massive government contract for affordable housing development across 5 states. The preliminary agreements were already in place, but the final contract required proof of capability through successful completion of a demonstration project. Veteran Village wasn't just my first challenge. It was the key that would unlock a $2 billion federal contract that would transform Hartwell Construction from a regional company into a national powerhouse. I spent 2 hours in that vault reading every document twice and taking notes on the back of bank deposit slips. By the time Patricia Walsh returned to check on my progress, I had a clear understanding of what my grandfather expected and a rough plan for accomplishing it. "Mrs. Walsh," I said, gathering the documents carefully, "I need to know something. Has my family tried to access any of these accounts or make any major financial decisions since the will reading?" Her smile was answer enough before she spoke. "Your father made several calls yesterday afternoon trying to authorize fund transfers and investment changes. I informed him that all estate accounts require a 30-day waiting period before any modifications can be implemented. Standard procedure for inheritance of this magnitude. Standard procedure that my grandfather had undoubtedly arranged to give me time to complete his challenges. Everything had been planned with the precision of a master craftsman laying the foundation for a skyscraper." As I prepared to leave the vault, Patricia handed me one final envelope I'd missed in my initial excitement. Inside was a simple key attached to a leather keychain with the Hartwell Construction logo embossed in gold. "Your grandfather's truck," she explained. "It's been maintained in our executive parking garage since his death. He wanted you to use it for your work, said you'd understand the significance." I did understand. That truck had been his mobile office, his connection to job sites, his symbol of staying grounded despite financial success. It represented everything he tried to teach me about leadership through example rather than authority through position. Walking out of that bank, I felt the weight of $800 million in responsibility settling on my shoulders. But for the first time since sitting in that law office, I also felt something else: excitement. My grandfather had given me the chance to prove that his faith in me was justified, and I had no intention of letting him down. The construction site for Veteran Village looked like a disaster zone when I arrived the next morning. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete foundation, tarps flapped loosely over incomplete framing, and construction equipment sat rusted under months of weather exposure. But as I walked through the mess, I could see my grandfather's vision taking shape beneath the neglect. Jake Morrison emerged from a small trailer at the far end of the site, coffee mug in hand, and wearing the same weathered work jacket I remembered from my teenage summers spent learning construction basics. At 62, Jake still moved with the purposeful stride of someone who'd spent 4 decades turning blueprints into reality. "Billy Hartwell," he said, extending a calloused hand for a firm handshake. "I wondered when you'd show up. Your grandfather always said you'd figure things out eventually." The relief in Jake's voice told me everything I needed to know about the past few months. "Jake, I need to know exactly what happened here. My grandfather's files give me the financial picture, but I want to hear it from someone who was actually swinging hammers." Jake's expression darkened as he led me through the construction site, pointing out problems that had accumulated since work stopped. "Your father showed up here 3 months ago with some fancy lawyers and accountants. Said the project was over budget and behind schedule, which was complete nonsense. We were actually ahead of schedule despite weather delays." He stopped next to a stack of lumber that had warped beyond usefulness, representing thousands of dollars in wasted materials. "Richard ordered us to stop work, immediately said he was redirecting funds to more profitable investments. When I argued that we had commitments to the veterans who'd already been promised housing, he fired me on the spot." The casual cruelty of my father's decision hit me harder than I expected. These weren't just construction workers to be dismissed. They were craftsmen who'd helped build the Hartwell reputation. Jake had worked alongside my grandfather since the early days, when the company consisted of 3 men and a shared pickup truck. "What about the rest of the crew?" I asked, already knowing I'd need every experienced worker I could find. Jake's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile I'd seen since arriving. "That's the beautiful part, Billy. Not one of them took another permanent job. Carlos has been doing electrical side work, Frank's been helping his nephew with plumbing repairs, and Tony started building custom cabinets in his garage. But they all said the same thing: they'd wait for Hartwell Construction to call them back." The loyalty these men showed to my grandfather's memory reinforced everything I'd learned about building relationships through respect rather than fear. While my father saw employees as interchangeable resources, my grandfather had created a team of craftsmen who took personal pride in every project bearing the Hartwell name. Jake pulled out his cell phone and started making calls while I examined the building plans more carefully. Within an hour, Carlos Ramirez arrived in his van, loaded with electrical supplies. Frank DeMarco pulled up 10 minutes later, followed by Tony Castellano, driving a truck that had seen better days but obviously received meticulous maintenance. The reunion felt like a family gathering, rather than a business meeting. These men had worked together for so many years they communicated through glances and gesture as much as words. Carlos, a compact man with graying temples and forearms, marked by years of electrical work, assessed the site's power situation with the efficiency of someone who'd solved similar problems dozens of times. Frank, whose plumbing expertise had saved countless projects from costly delays, traced water lines through the unfinished buildings while taking notes on his ever-present clipboard. Tony examined the framing work with the eye of an artist, running his hands along joints and connections to verify structural integrity. "Boys," Jake announced after everyone had completed their assessments, "Billy's taking over this project. We've got 27 days to complete 24 housing units, and I don't know about you, but I'm tired of watching this place fall apart." The response was immediate and unanimous. Carlos started calculating electrical requirements. Frank began planning plumbing installations, and Tony sketched modifications to speed up the framing process. These weren't employees following orders. They were craftsmen eager to finish something they'd started with pride. But as we developed our work schedule, a new problem emerged. My father hadn't just stopped funding for the project. He'd also allowed permits to expire and canceled material orders that had been scheduled for delivery. We'd need new city approvals, updated inspections, and suppliers willing to deliver materials on short notice. "Billy," Jake said quietly, pulling me aside while the others discussed logistics, "there's something else you need to know about why your father really stopped this project." He led me to a corner of the site where surveyors' stakes marked the future community center. "Your grandfather designed this development to be completely self-sufficient solar panels, rainwater collection, even a small workshop where the veterans could learn construction skills and earn income through light manufacturing." The scope was breathtaking and completely in line with my grandfather's philosophy of creating lasting value rather than quick profits. But Jake's expression suggested there was more to the story. Richard called it a waste of money, said affordable housing should be as cheap as possible to maximize profit margins. When your grandfather refused to cut corners on accessibility features and energy efficiency, Richard started undermining the project behind his back. The betrayal cut deep. My father had actively sabotaged his own father's final project, prioritizing short-term profits over long-term community impact. But as I studied the plans more carefully, I realized my grandfather had anticipated this possibility. Hidden within the technical specifications were references to federal energy efficiency standards and accessibility compliance requirements that would qualify the project for substantial government rebates and tax incentives. Completing the development exactly as designed wouldn't just house veterans. It would demonstrate the kind of innovative construction that major clients looked for when awarding large contracts. "Jake," I said, making a decision that would commit us to an incredibly challenging timeline. "We're not just going to finish this project. We're going to finish it exactly the way my grandfather designed it, with every feature and upgrade he included." The older man's grin reminded me why he'd been my grandfather's trusted foreman for so many years. "Billy, your grandfather always said you understood the difference between building something and building something right. Let's show this city what Hartwell construction can accomplish when we're not worried about cutting corners." Over the next 6 hours, we transformed chaos into organized activity. Carlos began rewiring the electrical systems to accommodate solar panel installations. Frank mapped out the rainwater collection plumbing, and Tony started modifying framing plans to accommodate the accessibility features my father had tried to eliminate. I spent the afternoon dealing with permits and inspections, learning quickly that my grandfather's reputation opened doors that might have remained closed for other contractors. City officials who remembered Thomas Hartwell's integrity were willing to expedite approvals for his grandson, especially for a project designed to serve elderly veterans. By evening, we had a complete work schedule, material delivery times, and a timeline that would complete Veteran Village with 3 days to spare. But as I drove my grandfather's truck away from the construction site, I couldn't shake the feeling that my father wouldn't let us work without interference. That feeling proved prophetic when I found a legal document taped to my apartment door threatening to shut down the project unless I could prove legitimate authorization to restart construction work. The legal papers from my father's attorney were dated that morning, filed barely 8 hours after I'd started work at the construction site. The threat was clear: cease all activity at Veteran Village immediately or face criminal charges for trespassing and destruction of property. I sat in my small apartment staring at documents that accused me of unlawfully interfering with estate assets and endangering workers through unauthorized construction activity. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so potentially devastating to my timeline. My first instinct was to call Harold Patterson, the estate attorney, but something made me pause. This felt like exactly the kind of challenge my grandfather would have anticipated. He'd spent 60 years dealing with people who used legal intimidation to get their way. And he'd taught me that the best response to threats was often unexpected action rather than defensive reaction. Instead of hiding in my apartment, I decided to confront my family directly. They were celebrating their windfall at the Riverside Country Club, an exclusive establishment where my grandfather had maintained membership for 40 years, despite preferring construction site trailers to mahogany-paneled dining rooms. The country club's main dining room sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished silverware, creating an atmosphere of refined wealth that felt completely foreign to someone who ate most meals from food trucks parked outside construction sites. I spotted my family immediately. They'd claimed the largest table near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course. My father held court at the head of the table, gesturing expansively as he described investment plans for his $200 million inheritance. Derek lounged beside him, scrolling through luxury car websites on his tablet, while cousins discussed private jet charters and European vacation packages. I approached their table, wearing the same work clothes I'd worn to the construction site, my boots still carrying traces of mud from the Veteran Village project. The contrast between my appearance and the dining room's elegance couldn't have been more pronounced, but I'd learned to use such contrasts to my advantage. "Hello, Dad," I said, pulling out an empty chair without waiting for an invitation. "I got your legal papers. Very thoughtful of you to hand-deliver them to my door." My father's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Having his disappointment of a son interrupt their celebration in such a public setting clearly violated his sense of proper social behavior. "Billy, this is neither the time nor the place for whatever grievance you think you have," he said through gritted teeth, glancing around nervously at other diners who'd started paying attention to our conversation. "Actually, Dad, I think this is the perfect place," I replied, keeping my voice calm and conversational. "See, I've been thinking about your legal threats, and I realized something interesting about the timeline." Derek looked up from his tablet, suddenly interested in a conversation he'd been ignoring. My cousin stopped discussing vacation plans and focused on what seemed like it might become entertaining family drama. I reached into my work jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind construction supervisors use to document site conditions and safety issues. This is a recording of a conversation my grandfather had with his attorney 6 months ago, discussing his concerns about unauthorized changes to the Veteran Village project. The effect was immediate. My father's confident demeanor cracked slightly, and Derek actually set down his tablet to give me his full attention. In this recording, I continued. "My grandfather specifically mentions that he's discovered someone has been diverting project funds and interfering with construction schedules. He asks his attorney to investigate whether this constitutes fraud or embezzlement. I hadn't actually found any such recording, but my father's panicked expression told me I'd hit close to the truth. Years of working with experienced construction crews had taught me how to read people's reactions to pressure, and my father was definitely feeling pressure. "You're bluffing," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. Grandpa never recorded private conversations. That's when Derek surprised everyone at the table, including me. He slid a small flash drive across the table, positioning it directly in front of me while maintaining eye contact with our father. Actually, Derek said quietly, "I think Billy might be more right than he knows." The flash drive was unmarked, but Derek's expression suggested it contained information that could change everything. My father stared at his younger son with complete shock, clearly unprepared for betrayal from that quarter. "Derek, what are you doing?" My father demanded, his voice rising enough to attract attention from neighboring tables. "I'm tired of pretending I don't know what you've been doing, Dad." Derek replied, his usual casual demeanor replaced by something approaching disgust. "Billy's been working construction for 10 years, while I've been sitting in an office reviewing financial reports. You want to guess what I've found?" The family gathering had transformed into something resembling a corporate boardroom confrontation. Derek pulled out his own tablet and opened a spreadsheet application displaying columns of numbers that meant nothing to our cousins, but clearly terrified our father. For the past 15 years, Derek continued, "Dad has been systematically transferring money from active construction projects to personal investment accounts. Small amounts, never enough to shut down a project entirely, but enough to create constant budget shortfalls." My cousins suddenly looked uncomfortable, realizing they might be witnessing the exposure of serious financial crimes. Jennifer checked her phone, probably calculating how their inheritances might be affected if Derek's accusations proved accurate. The Veteran Village project wasn't behind budget because of construction problems, Derek explained, looking directly at me. It was behind budget because Dad moved $300,000 from the project account to fund a private real estate investment that went bad. The numbers hit me like a physical blow. $300,000 would have easily covered the remaining construction costs and prevented the work stoppage that had left the project vulnerable to weather damage. My father attempted to regain control of the situation through intimidation, a tactic I'd watched him use countless times during my childhood. "Derek, you have no idea what you're talking about. Business finances are complicated, and you're misinterpreting normal cash flow management." But Derek was no longer the easily manipulated younger son who'd spent his 20s following our father's direction without question. "Dad, I have 15 years of bank records, transfer authorizations, with your signature and documentation of projects that failed because of mysterious funding shortfalls." The flash drive Derek had given me contained copies of everything financial records, proving embezzlement, email communications, showing deliberate project sabotage, and evidence that our father had been systematically weakening Hartwell Construction's reputation to justify selling the company to a competitor. As I reviewed Derek's documentation on his tablet, a larger picture emerged. My father hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been actively undermining my grandfather's business to force a sale that would have netted him a substantial broker's commission while destroying 60 years of family legacy. "Derek," I said, understanding for the first time why my brother had laughed at my $40 inheritance. "How long have you known about this?" His answer surprised me with its honesty. "I've suspected for 3 years, but I've been documenting everything for the past 18 months. I was waiting for the right moment to present evidence to Grandpa, but then he got sick, and I thought maybe I could handle Dad quietly after the funeral." The family table had become a battlefield where alliances shifted by the minute. Our cousins realized their inheritances might disappear if the estate discovered fraud. Derek had positioned himself as a whistleblower, seeking justice. My father sat trapped by evidence he couldn't deny. But I held the strongest position because I was the only person at that table who knew the truth about my grandfather's real will and the temporary nature of everyone's inheritance. Dad, I said, standing up and pocketing Derek's flash drive. You've got 48 hours to confess your embezzlement to the estate attorney and return every stolen dollar to company accounts. If you don't, Derek and I will present this evidence to the board of directors, the state attorney general, and every construction industry publication in the region. My father's face had gone from red to pale white. Billy, you don't understand the complexity of what you're threatening. This family's reputation, our social standing, everything we've built could be destroyed. Dad, I replied, walking away from their table while everyone in the dining room pretended not to watch our family drama unfold. You already destroyed it. I'm just cleaning up the mess. As I reached the dining room exit, Derek caught up with me, moving faster than I'd seen him move since high school. Billy, wait, he said, slightly out of breath. There's something else you need to know about why I gave you that evidence. His next words would prove that my grandfather's test had revealed family loyalties I'd never suspected. Derek followed me into the country club's parking lot, away from the curious stares of diners who'd witnessed our family confrontation. Under the soft glow of decorative lighting, my brother looked younger than his 26 years, stripped of the confident facade he'd worn throughout our childhood. Billy, I need you to understand something. He began, leaning against my grandfather's pickup truck. I didn't give you that evidence to help you win some inheritance battle. I gave it to you because Grandpa deserved better than what Dad was doing to his company. The sincerity in Derek's voice caught me off guard. Growing up, we'd been competitive about everything: grades, sports, our grandfather's attention. Success and family expectations had driven us apart, but apparently shared disgust at our father's behavior was bringing us back together. How much do you actually know about what's been happening? I asked, studying my brother's face for signs of deception. Derek's answer revealed a level of business awareness I hadn't given him credit for. I know Dad's been embezzling, I know he's been sabotaging projects, and I know he's been negotiating secretly with Morrison Industries to sell Hartwell Construction for parts. Morrison Industries was our biggest competitor, a corporate construction company that specialized in cheap, fast builds with minimal quality standards. The idea of my grandfather's legacy being absorbed by Morrison represented everything Thomas Hartwell had fought against during his career. But here's what really bothers me. Derek continued, his voice gaining strength as he talked. I've been watching you work construction for 10 years, and I've seen the respect you get from crews, suppliers, and clients. Dad talks about you like you're some kind of failure, but everyone in the industry knows you're the best young foreman in the city. This was the longest, honest conversation Derek and I had shared since we were teenagers, and it was revealing aspects of our family dynamics I'd never fully understood. Derek, why haven't you said anything before now? Why wait until after the will reading? His answer explained years of confusing family interactions. Because I thought Dad might change after Grandpa died. I thought maybe he'd realize that continuing the embezzlement would dishonor Grandpa's memory. Instead, he's gotten worse. Derek pulled out his phone and showed me recent bank transactions I hadn't seen in his flash drive documentation. Our father had already transferred $5 million from his inheritance into the same private investment accounts he'd used for stolen construction funds. Billy, he's not just stealing from the company anymore. He's stealing from his own inheritance, which means he's stealing from the estate, which means he's stealing from all of us. The implications were staggering. If my father was misappropriating estate funds, it could void the entire will and trigger federal investigations that would freeze everything for years. My 30-day deadline would become meaningless if the estate got tied up in criminal proceedings. There's more, Derek said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Dad's been meeting with Morrison Industries executives every week since Grandpa's funeral. They're planning to announce the acquisition as soon as the estate transfer is finalized. This was the missing piece of my father's strategy. He wasn't just embezzling money. He was positioning himself to sell Hartwell Construction to competitors who would strip the company of its assets, and eliminate its competition in the regional market. Derek, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. I said making a decision that would determine whether I could trust my brother with the truth about my grandfather's real will. What do you think should happen to Hartwell Construction? Derek's answer came without hesitation. It should stay in the family. Not because we deserve it, but because Grandpa built something worth preserving. The craftsmanship, the reputation, the relationships with clients and workers, you can't just sell that to the highest bidder. His response convinced me to take a calculated risk. I told Derek about the safety deposit box, the real will, and the 30-day challenge our grandfather had designed to test my worthiness as his successor. Derek listened without interruption, his expression cycling through shock, admiration, and something approaching relief. When I finished explaining the situation, he sat in silence for several minutes before responding. "Billy, that's the most Thomas Hartwell thing I've ever heard," he said finally. Of course, he'd create some elaborate test to make sure his successor actually understood the business. But Derek's next question revealed he'd been thinking beyond just family dynamics. What happens to Dad's inheritance if you succeed? I explained the reversal mechanism. Every dollar the family had received would return to the company accounts, and I would become sole owner of the entire Hartwell empire. Good, Derek said emphatically. Dad doesn't deserve a penny of what he stole, and the rest of us haven't done anything to earn those inheritances except being born with the right last name. Derek's response suggested a level of integrity I hadn't expected, but I needed to understand his motivations completely before trusting him with sensitive information. Derek, if I succeed in this challenge, you lose $50 million. Are you really okay with that? His laugh contained genuine amusement rather than bitterness. Billy, I've been watching Dad steal from Grandpa for years, knowing it was wrong, but not having the courage to stop it. The idea that there's justice built into this situation, that someone who actually deserves the inheritance might get it, feels right. We spent the next hour developing a strategy that would protect the Veteran Village project while gathering additional evidence of our father's crimes. Derek's access to company financial records would be crucial for documenting the full scope of embezzlement, while my construction work would demonstrate the competence our grandfather had been testing for. But our planning session was interrupted by Derek's phone ringing. The caller ID showed our father's name, and Derek's expression suggested this wouldn't be a pleasant conversation. "Dad's probably panicking about the evidence I gave you," Derek said before answering. "He's going to try to convince me that family loyalty requires protecting him from consequences." Derek answered the call on speakerphone, allowing me to hear our father's increasingly desperate attempts to control a situation that had already slipped beyond his influence. "Derek, you need to get that flash drive back from your brother immediately," our father demanded without any preliminary greeting. "You don't understand what you've done to this family." "Actually, Dad, I understand exactly what I've done," Derek replied calmly. "I've documented 15 years of embezzlement, and now Billy has evidence that could send you to federal prison." The silence on the other end of the call stretched long enough that I wondered if our father had hung up. When he finally responded, his voice carried a tone I'd never heard before: genuine fear. "Boys, we can work this out privately. Family problems should stay within the family. Billy, if you're listening, I'm prepared to make a very generous settlement offer." I took Derek's phone and responded directly to our father's bribery attempt. "Dad, here's my counteroffer. Confess everything to Harold Patterson by tomorrow afternoon, return every stolen dollar with interest, and resign from any involvement in Hartwell Construction. In exchange, Derek and I won't file criminal charges. And if I refuse, then in 26 days, when I've completed Grandpa's challenges and inherited everything you thought you'd stolen, you'll be facing federal prosecutors instead of family negotiations." I hung up before he could respond, but Derek was staring at me with an expression of complete amazement. "Billy, do you realize what just happened? You basically declared war on Dad, using evidence I provided while betting everything on challenges that might be impossible to complete." He was right, but I'd learned something important from years of construction work. Sometimes the biggest risks produce the most reliable foundations. Derek Grandpa didn't design this test expecting me to fail. He designed it expecting me to prove that everything he'd taught me about building something lasting was worth preserving. 2 hours later, I received a call from Jake Morrison that would change everything again. The Veteran Village project had attracted attention from federal housing officials who wanted to discuss expanding our affordable housing program to a national scale. The call from Jake came at 6 o'clock the next morning while I was reviewing construction schedules over coffee in my grandfather's truck. Jake's voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard since the early days of my construction education. "Billy, you need to get down to the job site immediately. We've got visitors who are going to change everything." I arrived at Veteran Village to find 3 official government vehicles parked next to our construction equipment. Men and women in business suits walked through the partially completed buildings, taking photographs and measurements while discussing details I couldn't quite hear from a distance. Jake met me at the site entrance, practically vibrating with energy. "Billy, these are federal housing officials from Washington. They've been monitoring this project since your grandfather first proposed it 8 months ago." The lead official, a woman named Sandra Chen, who directed the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Innovative Housing Initiative, approached us with a thick folder of documents and an expression that suggested serious business discussions were about to begin. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, extending her hand for a professional handshake, "I'm very sorry for your family's loss. Your grandfather was pioneering affordable housing concepts that we've been hoping to implement on a national scale." She gestured toward the buildings where her team continued their evaluation. "The energy efficiency standards, accessibility features, and community integration elements of this development represent exactly the kind of innovation we need for our nationwide affordable housing program." Sandra's next words confirmed my grandfather's strategic planning had extended far beyond anything I'd discovered in that safety deposit box. 6 months ago, your grandfather submitted preliminary proposals for a federal contract worth $2 billion over 5 years. The contract involves building affordable housing developments in 47 cities across 5 states, using the Veteran Village project as our demonstration of capability. $2 billion. The number seemed impossible until Sandra showed me the scope of what the federal government wanted to accomplish. Climate-controlled housing for elderly veterans, energy-efficient apartments for low-income families, and transitional housing for homeless individuals, all built to standards that would serve as models for private developers. However, Sandra continued, the contract requires proof of successful project completion before we can finalize agreements. We need to see that Hartwell Construction can deliver on promises made in the proposal. Jake's grin told me he'd already understood the implications, but Sandra made them explicit. If you complete Veteran Village exactly as your grandfather designed it within the timeline specified in our preliminary agreements, Hartwell Construction becomes our primary contractor for the largest affordable housing initiative in federal history. The timeline specified in their agreements was 28 days from today. My grandfather had coordinated his 30-day challenge with federal contracting requirements, ensuring that success in his personal test would automatically qualify me for the business opportunity he'd been developing. Sandra's team spent 4 hours evaluating our construction progress, interviewing our crew members, and reviewing our plans for completing the project. Their questions revealed the depth of my grandfather's preparation. Every innovation we'd implemented had been specifically chosen to meet federal standards for sustainable, accessible housing. Carlos walked the electrical inspector through our solar panel installation, explaining how the system would generate enough power to make each housing unit energy independent while feeding excess electricity back to the city grid. Frank demonstrated the rainwater collection system that would reduce municipal water consumption by 60%, while maintaining full accessibility for residents with mobility limitations. Tony showed the construction quality inspector framing techniques that exceeded building codes while reducing construction time through modular assembly methods my grandfather had developed over decades of experience. But the most impressive evaluation came when Sandra interviewed our residents-to-be elderly veterans who'd been waiting 8 months for construction to resume. Their stories of military service, subsequent struggles with housing insecurity, and gratitude for the community features my grandfather had included brought tears to Sandra's eyes. "Mr. Hartwell," she said as her team prepared to leave, "your grandfather understood something that many developers miss: affordable housing isn't just about providing shelter. It's about creating communities where people can rebuild their lives with dignity." Sandra handed me official documentation that would expedite every permit inspection and approval we'd need to complete the project. More importantly, she provided preliminary contract documents showing the scope of work Hartwell Construction would receive upon successful completion of our demonstration project. $2 billion over 5 years with options for expansion if our performance met expectations. The contract would employ hundreds of workers, establish Hartwell Construction as a national leader in affordable housing, and create a legacy worthy of my grandfather's vision. But as Sandra's team departed, I realized my father's legal threats could still derail everything. His embezzlement and sabotage had created financial irregularities that could invalidate our federal contract eligibility if discovered during background investigations. That afternoon, Harold Patterson called with news that would resolve the legal situation permanently. My father had arrived at the law office with his own attorney, prepared to confess his embezzlement and negotiate a settlement that would avoid criminal prosecution. "Billy," Harold said, "your father has agreed to return $4.8 million in stolen funds, plus interest and penalties. He's also signed documents transferring all voting rights in Hartwell Construction to you effective immediately." The confession triggered the reversal mechanism in my grandfather's real will. Every dollar my family had received in the public will, reading returned automatically to Hartwell Construction accounts, while I gained complete control of the company 3 weeks ahead of my 30-day deadline. Derek called an hour later with news about our family's reactions to losing their inheritances. Our cousins were furious, but legally powerless to challenge a will they'd never bothered to read carefully. My mother surprisingly expressed pride that her father-in-law's legacy would continue through someone who understood its value. Billy Derrick said, "I have a proposal for you. If you're willing to hire me as Chief Financial Officer, I'd like to spend the next 5 years helping you build something that would make Grandpa proud." Derrick's proposal made sense from every perspective. He understood the financial side of construction business, he'd proven his integrity by exposing our father's crimes, and he'd demonstrated loyalty to family legacy over personal profit. But more than that, Derrick represented the possibility of rebuilding family relationships around shared values rather than inherited wealth. Working together to honor our grandfather's vision could heal years of competition and misunderstanding. The Veteran Village project reached completion 2 days ahead of schedule. 24 elderly veterans moved into housing designed specifically for their needs, while federal officials conducted their final inspection with obvious satisfaction. Sandra Chen returned for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, bringing contracts that would transform Hartwell Construction from a regional company into a national leader in affordable housing. As I signed documents worth $2 billion, I thought about my grandfather's wisdom in testing character before conferring authority. The federal contract required establishing regional offices in 12 cities, hiring 300 additional workers, and developing new construction techniques for rapid deployment of affordable housing. Everything my grandfather had taught me about building lasting value rather than seeking quick profits would guide our approach to this massive expansion. 6 months later, Hartwell Construction employed over 400 people, had completed affordable housing projects in 8 states, and maintained the reputation for quality craftsmanship that my grandfather had established 60 years earlier. Derrick proved himself an exceptional chief financial officer, implementing transparency measures that prevented any possibility of future embezzlement, while optimizing our resources for maximum community impact. Working together had restored the brotherhood we'd lost during our competitive teenage years. My father faced federal charges for embezzlement, but received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperating with investigators examining financial fraud in the construction industry. His cooperation helped prosecutors build cases against other companies that had been stealing from affordable housing programs. Our expanded crew included many of the workers who'd been laid off when my father sabotaged projects throughout his embezzlement years. Jake Morrison became our director of operations, overseeing construction quality across all federal contract projects while mentoring young workers the way he'd once mentored me. But the most meaningful success came from watching elderly veterans, low-income families, and homeless individuals move into housing that provided not just shelter, but genuine community. My grandfather's vision of construction as a tool for social improvement had found expression on a national scale. One year after that humiliating will reading, I stood in the original Veteran Village Community Center, watching residents work in the wood shop my grandfather had designed. Carlos was teaching electrical safety to veterans interested in construction careers. Frank was training residents in basic plumbing repairs, and Tony was helping them build furniture for their new homes. This was my grandfather's true legacy, not the money he'd accumulated, but the knowledge he'd passed on, and the communities he'd helped create. The $40 inheritance that had seemed like family rejection had actually been the key to everything he'd really wanted to leave behind. Derek joined me in the community center reviewing financial reports that showed our company's continued growth and our residents' success in rebuilding their lives. The federal contract had exceeded all performance expectations, leading to additional opportunities that would keep us busy for the next decade. Billy Derrick said, looking around at the bustling activity surrounding us, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never noticed those markings on the $20 bills?" I did wonder sometimes. But mostly, I felt grateful for a grandfather wise enough to understand that the most valuable inheritances can't be transferred through legal documents. They have to be earned through the daily choice to build something lasting rather than something easy. As I drove home that evening in my grandfather's truck, I thought about the life lesson he'd been teaching me since childhood. Success isn't about what you're given, but what you build with your own hands and heart. True leadership requires earning respect through character and hard work, not demanding it through inheritance or position. The construction business had taught me that the strongest foundations are built slowly, carefully, and with attention to every detail. The same principles applied to family relationships, business ethics, and community development. Everything worth preserving required the patience to do things right rather than the convenience of doing things quickly. My grandfather's test had revealed not just my worthiness to inherit his business, but my commitment to the values that had made it worth inheriting. The billions of dollars in contracts, the hundreds of employees, and the thousands of people housed through our projects were all built on the foundation of that simple lesson: build something that matters, and it will matter to others. Now I want to ask you something. Have you ever discovered that what seemed like the worst thing that happened to you was actually the beginning of the best thing in your life? Maybe a job you lost led to a better career, or a relationship that ended opened the door to finding your true partner. Sometimes life's biggest disappointments are really disguised opportunities, waiting for us to prove ourselves worthy of something better. I'd love to hear your story about how a difficult moment became a turning point towards something amazing. Share your experience in the comments below, because I believe we all have moments when $40 turns into something worth billions, not in money, but in purpose and meaning. If this story reminded you that hard work and integrity always pay off in the end, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people discovering extraordinary possibilities in their lives. Share this with someone who might need to remember that their current disappointment could be tomorrow's greatest opportunity. Thank you for joining me on this journey, And remember, sometimes the smallest inheritances carry the greatest potential. Keep building something that matters, and I'll see you in the next story.